everybody in the world.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you that if you feel so inclined throughout the show, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features if you wish to interact with it a little bit more directly or contribute by leaving a tip or donation. You can also do this at our website, gsmcspodcast.net. Under here on the ticker on my screen. You can do it by clicking the Super Chat button as well on YouTube. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of the day, talking about some key injury updates that might affect certain decision making for your first round playoff matchup in fantasy. And not for nothing, I do feel that Blurpy's comments actually did affect this segment in a positive manner, because I was worried about how certain people would view these injuries, whether it be in a positive or negative light. Always you have to think about injuries in a negative light, because you always wish for the player's speedy recovery. But from a fantasy perspective, you have to think about it a little bit more analytically. And some of these injuries I was worried about, because these are certainly bad teams we might be talking about here, but it's about the players who are most impacted either positively or negatively as a result that Blurpy certainly suggested in that regard. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with a team potential Super Bowl preview matchup here this week for them, but with two key injuries that could impact positively a player who I do feel like needs to get going in this offense. How about Keon Coleman and Dalton Kincaid, two guys who have had on and off injury problems throughout the season. I do believe that both of them will be active in that matchup against the Lions. Don't quote me on that, because I will have to check. But ultimately, if one or both of them do not play in this game, I do feel like Josh is going to trust, Amari Cooper a little bit more. Because I feel like now is the time when, if you're the Bills and you know that you're capable of playing two different styles, look into what Amari Cooper can bring to you. Because I feel like right now he's not necessarily hurting the Bills, because we know that Josh Allen can carry this team on his back, James Cook can go off, and they have a very talented skill core. But he's not exactly really helping them either. Because if this were the case, and Amari Cooper was excellent each and every single week, then it would be a no-brainer as to who my Super Bowl pick would be. But right now, the reason why I slightly favor Detroit in this matchup is because if Josh Allen doesn't trust Amari Cooper, chances are this Bills defense will continue to decline, and you're going to have to play shootout football, which the Bills are built for, but you don't necessarily want to get to that point all the time. So, in this matchup, look for Josh Allen to try and trust Amari Cooper a little bit more. Obviously, you know you still have Khalil Shakir, and we know what he can do after the catch. You still have James Cook in the backfield, and we all know how hot he can get. But I do think that the Bills' season revolves around the development of Amari Cooper in this offense. So, if both of those players are absent, like I said, Coleman and Kincaid, look for potentially Amari Cooper to really have a decent game. And then another injury that was alluded to in that last episode through Blurpy's comments, I thank you for them again, talking about K9, because a lot of people are on the Zach Charbonnet hype train after what he did last week against Arizona. So should K9 not play in this very pivotal matchup against the Packers at home, which we'll talk about later, I do feel like Zach Charbonnet's value is going to skyrocket. And not for nothing, I was completely wrong about him. I do feel like people are really buying into what Zach Charbonnet can do outside of the stylistic nature of what Kenneth Walker does. Because, let's be clear here, the offensive line has been absolutely horrid as a Seahawks fan in terms of run protection, both in short yardage and in long yardage situations. But I do feel that out of both of these guys, Zach Charbonnet does have better vision. He's not someone who's just going to make too many cuts and try and get fancy at the line. No. When he sees the coverage, when he sees what his O-line is doing for them, he makes the correct reads, and he just runs as much as he can. He runs to gain yardage, not to necessarily try and house it, even though we know he has that ability after that long run against Arizona. So that's why I feel like a lot of people are really excited and thrilled that Zach Charbonnet is getting this chance. So I do think his value was still viable this week against Green Bay, against a much tougher defense, because I do feel like Seattle wants to build something in the run game as well there, because they want to definitely take pressure off Geno, even though he's lived up to the pressure and overcome the pressure these past couple of weeks without throwing interceptions. But I do feel like in order for Seattle to ultimately win this division, it's going to come down to the run game and how it develops. And was a positive sign of improvement last week against Arizona, carrying over into this very pivotal week against Green Bay. So, if K9 is absent, then potentially Zach Charbonnet can have another big day for you. Let's talk about two quarterbacks. Very, very bad teams and bad situations all around, but still potentially opportunities could abound for certain players here. So let's talk about Derek Carr and Aiden O'Connell. Let's talk about Derek Carr first, because ultimately a lot of people can become excited again, potentially, about Alvin Kamara. Because a lot of people might be disappointed in Alvin Kamara this season because of the fact that after that 2-game stretch at the beginning of the season where it looked like he was going to light the league up yet again, to now, he's been highly, highly disappointing for all fantasy football owners who have him. But in the absence of Derek Carr, I do feel like they're going to have to entrust Alvin Kamara a little bit more, because I do like what they have in guys like Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener. In the best moments of his early spot starts for Spencer Rattler, we saw what he could be able to do should they choose that he's the future of the franchise, but I don't necessarily think they will, because they are in a very weird space cap-wise. But ultimately, should they decide to move on with him on their roster, they can see that they have a guy who can make dual threat plays, can extend plays, but most importantly, understands that he doesn't necessarily have to do too much. And obviously, the issues will still be there, no matter who takes over the reins to close out the season for New Orleans. But ultimately, I do feel like Spencer Rattler, out of both of those guys, him and Haener, can rely a lot more on Alvin Kamara. And we saw it a little bit. He tried as often as he could to get the ball to Alvin Kamara. And through no fault of his own, and through no fault of Alvin Kamara's own, their offensive line simply couldn't hold up. But now in the second go-around, I do feel like both of them now know a little bit more about each other and know how much they're going to have to rely on each other as a result. So look for that trust to carry over down this rest. They may not win many games, but ultimately, if this could be the future of what we see in New Orleans, then getting this development together and getting it going could pay dividends in the future for as long as Alvin Kamara stays there. So that could be a positive development for Alvin Kamara owners in this fantasy postseason. And let's talk about Aiden O'Connell, another kind of illusion that Blurpy made. Potentially certain running backs getting more looks now that Desmond Ridder is going to look like he's going to see out the season. And ultimately, I feel like this is an ominous sign as to the state of the Las Vegas quarterback room. Because I feel like if you look ahead, yes, it's certainly positive in terms of who you could get as a reward, technically, in the 2025 NFL Draft, but I do feel like it's harrowing. It's going to be harrowing if you're a Raiders fan these next couple of weeks to see the Raiders roll out Desmond Ridder and Sincere McCormick as their backfield on the offense. Because ultimately, I do feel like, Sincere McCormick does look like perhaps the most competent running back the Raiders have right now, because Alexander Madison didn't do anything. Zamir White's been largely a disappointment after he got a lot of before the season hype. But ultimately, I do feel like when I look at the Raiders, it could be a blessing in disguise, And I never want to say that in a negative light, because I do wish both of those guys the best, both Minshew and O'Connell, in their NFL careers. And I do hope for speedy recoveries for both of them. But ultimately, when you look at the state of the Raiders right now, there's no way any quarterback can succeed. But ultimately, when I look at the weapons they have, there's potential there. So I'm excited to see how this season plays out, no matter what the quarterback situation is, because of the talent they may have. I like a guy like Sincere McCormick. I like a guy like Brock Bowers. Maybe Jacoby Myers gets going as well. So ultimately, I want to see what these pieces in the Raiders offense can do if, they're entrusted down the stretch. And last but not least, let's talk about the disappointment and this ultimately sad situation with Jonathan Brooks here. Because I talked about Jonathan Brooks before the season and what his injury situation could mean for the Panthers' running situation this season. And now that he came back after a much longer stay in the PUP list than a lot of people expected, he suffered another injury. But ultimately, it's not like it's as bad a situation for the Panthers' running game as people think, because Chuba Hubbard has been reinvigorated these past few weeks after the reinstallment of Bryce Young with the QB position. And I feel like, when Jonathan Brooks gets fully incorporated into this offense, it's going to remain that way, because both of these guys bring different elements to this Carolina Panthers running back room. When Jonathan Brooks is healthy, and as a Texas fan, I saw this in his senior year, he can get open in the receiving game. He can get downhill in a hurry. He's a fantastic red zone back as well. And he complements Chuba Hubbard as well, because Chuba Hubbard also brings that physicality. And so if you have two very workman-like backs with one who has more of an explosive side to him, then chances are this backfield can get going in 2025. And I feel like as a result, Bryce Young's only going to gain more and more confidence in these two guys and thus get better and better. And so even though it's kind of a bad situation for Jonathan Brooks to start his NFL career, I'm excited for the long-term future of that Panthers backfield, because I know what it can look like when both of those guys are out there. So ultimately, this is more about monitoring the long-term situations of these injuries, but ultimately, it may have you rejigger some things for your roster for the first round matchup in your fantasy postseason. But let me know what you think about them in the comments below. Coming up next, though, I'm going to be making my picks for the biggest games of the NFL weekend. Should be an exciting segment. We'll be right back after this short break to do it.